Today is a beautiful, sunny, I think it's Tuesday. I'm on my way to work and we are going to be going through beginner tips and tricks. Not so much for the individual who's wanting to go welding as a career path, but this is more for the DIYer, the maker, the person who wants to make projects in their shop, in their home setup, or fix things around the farm or the house, and they don't currently know how to weld. Now, with that said, the first tip or trick, I guess it's more of a tip, is going to be know what you want to weld, and that's going to dictate what kind of process you're going to use for welding. You can have more narrowed learning and focused learning, so it's going to be more efficient if you've identified what you're going to weld. Let me give you some examples. Shielded metal arc welding is probably the most common type of welding. That's going to be also known as stick welding. Now, that type of welding gets you very good structural welds. It's very hot. It's a little bit messy, but you can weld really thick pieces of metal together quite well using that method. So if you were wanting to get into structural welding, if you're wanting to do big structural type projects with thick metals, I would highly suggest that you start off with stick welding. Now, the second process or form of welding that needs to be narrowed in is MIG welding. So metal inert gas or wire feed welding is going to be a very quick and easy welding process. Now, typical small shops that are not going to be welding big structural items, things that are about 3/8, ½ inch and lower plate thicknesses, are going to be running MIG. This is because MIG is super clean because it uses gas in lieu of flux, like stick welding. Now, it's a little bit more of a headache, but it's a good process. Personally, I like to use MIG, especially from the fact that you don't have to clean up the welds afterwards. They look pretty. It's just a good process. Now, once you get into the thinner plate material, sheet metal, MIG is going to be a little bit easier to fine tune and manage the heat input into those plates so you're not burning through constantly. So if you know you're going to be using sheet metal or thinner plates, I would suggest MIG welding. Now, similar to MIG welding or wire feed welding is flux core welding. That's going to be fed with a wire electrode or wire for the welding mechanism, similar to MIG welding. The difference is there's not going to be any gas involved with the flux core. The wire's been rolled up and the flux is at the core, hence the name flux core. And that's going to be kind of a mix between MIG and your stick welding. Because it has flux, it's going to be a little bit more messy. You're going to get a lot of BBs. Slag is going to be left over the weld, and so you're going to have to clean up your welds after the fact with that process. But it's very cheap to get started with that process. The continual consumable of the wire, it's called a consumable, is a little bit more expensive than solid core wire or just running electrodes because they have to wrap that flux inside a wire setup and then spool it up. So you're going to have to kind of plan around that being a little bit more expensive from a continual usage standpoint, but the initial startup standpoint, you can get very cheap flux core welders. I think you can get Flux 125 from Harbor Freight. It runs off 120 volts for like $150. Like it's super cheap. It's not a lot of money to get started with flux core, and it's a good option. You're not going to be able to weld quite as thin a material as MIG, and you're not going to be able to weld quite as thick a material as stick, but it'll get you going. The fourth process that I want to talk about is TIG welding. That is a process I'm not super familiar with. I've watched some videos and done some research on it, but it seems to be a lot more skill involved with that process. So if you like getting into the skill of the technique, and a lot of the finer details on how to do a process like this, then I would suggest TIG welding. Now, TIG welding, tungsten inert gas welding, requires a tungsten rod, or I think it's called rod, with a sharp tip to create the arc. And then you have to push argon gas over that arc to keep it shielded from the oxygen in the environment. As well as the material that creates the weld is a separate rod that you use with your opposite hand. So like I said, there's a lot of skill. It's very involved, but it puts down a very clean, nice looking weld when you get it down. And you can actually weld very thick materials. You can weld very thin materials. You can weld aluminum. You can weld stainless steel. I would say TIG welding is probably the most versatile type of welding there is, but it's got a large barrier entry as far as the skill and knowledge required. So there you have it. Hopefully you can take that information if you're a beginner and you're wanting to get into welding, and select kind of the process you would like to focus in on with your learning. And then, yeah, just dive into that. Now, the second point going off of that is going to be watch YouTube videos. Now, Jody with Welding Tips and Tricks channel is an extremely valuable resource for learning how to weld in every process. Stick welding, MIG welding, I think he even does flux core, TIG welding. You can learn a lot of appropriate techniques and the fundamentals from the videos that he puts out. So I highly suggest that. Going off of that, once you kind of have done the research, you know which process you want to move forward with, practice, practice, practice.
I mean, listen, we talking about practice.
We talking about practice. Make sure and put in a ton of time and practice to develop that muscle memory and ability to see the pool of your weld and adjust how you're laying that bead or that weld down. One thing that's going to help with this, because it could get expensive if you're just trying to get your steel metal from like Lowe's, Tractor Supply, Home Depot, it's going to get expensive. I highly suggest you look up if there is a scrap metal yard somewhere close. Now, I have two in the town that I live, and they are extremely valuable to get cheap metal. Now, usually when I take a trip, I typically go over lunch break at my day job because it's only 5 minutes away from where I work. But you can get material or steel that is 35 cents on the pound, which is exponentially cheaper than what you're going to see at Lowe's or Tractor Supply. You can also get some really thick stuff, really thin stuff, pipe, structural shapes, your I-beams, H-beams, rec tube, square tube. You can find a lot of stuff at the scrapyard, and it's cheap. It's all the same price. So you can get a lot of practice in with scraps that you find at the scrapyard. Going off of practice, I alluded to the fact that you need to be able to see the weld puddle that is developing off your electrode, depending on the process. So what you need to do, looks like somebody got in an accident over there. A couple of cops. Somebody listening to some good music too. Okay, so getting back to practice and seeing that weld pool, it's essential you have good PPE or personal protective equipment. Now that equipment is going to include a welding helmet, safety glasses, gloves, a respirator, long sleeves. It's going to be super important that you make sure and protect yourself. Don't skip on the PPE. Now, one of the most critical things, like I was saying, is the weld puddle and being able to see that. Your welding helmet is probably the place you want to spend almost the most money. I suggest a good auto darkening lens So I currently have a Hobart, I think it's Inventor, and it works quite well. I would suggest at least spending $100 on your welding helmet. It's going to get you a lens that you can see through. It's going to be auto darkening so you can see where you're working and where you're starting, and it will auto darken for you. I also suggest that you take care of it. Don't just throw it around, crack the lens, scratch it up. Make sure you can see through that lens so you can put down some really nice welds. And then I also want to make sure that you understand that anytime you're welding, it doesn't matter the process. If you're not outside with a well or around a well-ventilated area, you need to make sure and wear your respirator. I try to always do that. Sometimes I forget, but it's going to pay dividends in the long run to make sure that your lungs last a long time, right? Now, the next tip, which I sometimes have trouble with, is to have fun. Make sure you're planning fun projects that you're going to enjoy, and don't get too hung up on making sure you can put down perfect welds. Sticking two pieces of metal together is the goal, right? So when you're getting into it and you're having trouble, even with sticking the metal together, do your research, practice, and you will get better with time. Your welds do not have to be perfect unless you're trying to be a social media influencer and post your pictures of your welds on Instagram, in which case you just need a lot more practice. As you're going along and you develop your skills, I highly suggest that you build your tools. This will make it more fun. You'll get to have better tools and you'll get to have practice. So a welding table is a great example of one of the first projects. You really don't need a welding table to begin with. You can build stuff on the ground. You see many YouTube videos that people are building stuff on the ground, and it works, right? Then you can move into stands, pipe stands, attachments for your welding table, stools. You can even weld up your own clamps. It's endless. Build your tools as much as you can. Now, talking about tools, for you to get started, you do not need to have all the tools in the world. You don't have to have a fireball tool table. You don't have to have a plasma cutter, and you don't have to have a Miller or a Lincoln Electric welding unit. You can get a Harbor Freight flux core welder for a little over $100, or heck, you can get the Amazon special from China. What is it, the Tulio or something? You can get cheap stick welders, flux core welders, and they work. Get them, practice. All you need is a welder and an angle grinder, and you can get almost any project done. There's so many projects you can do with those two items. The angle grinder, you can cut metal, you can grind metal, you can clean it up with a wire wheel or a flap disc, and then you can weld the pieces of metal with the welder. That's all you need, grinder, welder. And before I end with this truck session, the last thing that I want you to think about as you're getting into welding is weld distortion. So this has bit me in the butt time and time again, almost on every project. And you can plan it out and it still won't go as good. So with welding steel, you're putting a lot of heat in a very concentrated area, as well as having a molten pool of steel quickly cooling into a solid. Now with that process and that rapid cooling rate, you're gonna be pulling on the sides of your plate, your structural shapes, your anything you're welding. That weld is gonna pull on that side of the piece that you're welding on, or banana is what a lot of people call it. So if you put a weld bead on top of a flat plate at the center of the plate, that weld bead is going to cause that plate to curve up on the edges because it's pulling at the top of that. Now, one of the things you can do to counter that is put another weld bead on the opposite side to have it pull back. It won't always pull back to the same degree, but it will to some effect to help try to keep things flat. The second way to help kind of mitigate this is just weld sequencing. So if you weld on this side, then weld on that side, then weld on the opposite side or the opposite corner, and you kind of weld in different spots around the structure that you're welding or the project, it's going to have less tendency to pull on one side of it or one portion of your project to cause a lot of deformation from that weld, and you'll minimize the weld distortion. You'll probably still get some. And the third thing that'll help you counter weld distortion or weld draw is going to be heating the crap out of your component ahead of time. So it's a little bit more dangerous and you have to be careful with the part. But if you can get a large torch of some kind, a propane weed burner, and you heat up your component to 200, 250, 300 degrees, and then you put your welds down and continue to hit it with the heat afterwards, it's going to allow for those welds to have less impact on pulling on certain areas, and you'll get less weld distortion. All right, guys, I'm about to work. That's pretty much the extent of my beginner tips and tricks. I'm sure I missed something. Go ahead and comment below if I missed any key points for somebody who's just starting to get to welding, or comment below if you're trying to get into welding and you're not sure what direction to take. I'll try to comment and give you some advice in the comments section. Thank you guys for sticking with me for this long 20-minute discussion in my truck. I hope you had some value. Please consider subscribing if you did find it valuable, and I will see you on another day. Peace.